There was a time when the small house on Maplewood Lane echoed with laughter. The smell of freshly baked bread would drift through the open kitchen window, and a young boy's voice would fill the air with stories about school, dreams, and the promises of tomorrow. That boy was Ethan, my only son, and I was proud of him in ways that words could never describe. From the moment he was born, my world revolved around him. His first steps, his first fall, his first day of school. Every moment was stitched into the fabric of my life. I raised him alone after his father passed away when Ethan was just 7. Life was not easy, but love filled the gaps where money and comfort could not. We built our little world together, one day at a time. I worked 2 jobs, mornings at the local diner, evenings at a small grocery store. I never wanted him to feel the emptiness of loss or the pain of scarcity. Every time I came home exhausted, Ethan would bring me a glass of water and say, "One day, Mom, I'll make you rest. You'll never have to work again." Those words became my reason to push through every long night and every ache in my bones. Years passed. Ethan grew into a kind young man, smart, ambitious, and full of life. He got a scholarship, went to college, and landed a great job in the city. When he came home for holidays, he would bring gifts, tell stories about city life, and make me laugh until my eyes filled with tears. I could see the man he was becoming, responsible, successful, and gentle at heart. And deep down, I believed that no matter where life took him, I would always have a place in his heart. Then came the day he introduced me to her, Claire. She was beautiful, well-spoken, and from a good family. The moment I saw her, I could sense how much Ethan loved her. He looked at her with the kind of admiration that every mother dreams her son will one day give to someone who truly deserves it. And yet, behind my smile, I felt a quiet fear. I knew that love changes people. I just didn't know how much it would change him. The wedding came quickly. It was a small ceremony, intimate, elegant, and perfect in its simplicity. Ethan looked radiant, and Claire was glowing in her white dress. As they exchanged vows, I felt tears roll down my cheeks, tears of joy, pride, and a strange ache I couldn't name. The kind of ache that comes when you realize your child is stepping into a world where you no longer belong. After the wedding, they moved to the city. At first, Ethan called every day. He told me about his work, their new apartment, and the little things they were learning as a couple. But slowly, the calls started to fade. Once a day became once a week. Then once a week became once a month. Soon, even messages became rare. When I called, sometimes he wouldn't answer. Other times, he'd say, "Mom, I'm busy, I'll call you back." But the call never came. I tried to understand. Newlyweds have their lives, their moments, their worlds to build. I told myself it was just a phase. But as the weeks turned into months, I began to feel a growing silence in the house, a silence heavier than loneliness. Claire visited only once. She was polite but distant. I could feel her discomfort in my small home, her hesitation to sit too close, to touch things that weren't polished or modern. She looked around as if everything smelled of memories she couldn't relate to. I offered her tea. She barely took a sip. I tried to ask about her life, her work, but her answers were short, courteous but cold. That was the last time I saw her. The following months blurred into one another. My health began to weaken. The long hours of work, the loneliness, the weight of waiting, they took their toll. Sometimes I would sit by the window and watch the streetlights flicker, wondering if Ethan ever thought of me when he passed similar lights in the city. I never wanted much, just a call, a visit, maybe a "How are you, Mom?" But even that became rare. On my birthday, I baked a small cake for myself. I lit one candle and whispered his name before blowing it out. That night, I scrolled through his social media page, photos of him and Claire on vacations, dinners, smiling in places I'd never been. He looked happy, and yet I couldn't help but notice not once in any caption or story did he mention home. It was as if I had become a chapter he'd closed. The neighbors sometimes asked about him. "Your son must be doing great in the city," they'd say. I'd smile and nod, pretending everything was fine, pretending I wasn't the mother who had become a memory. Then, one evening, a heavy storm swept through town. The sky turned gray, and the sound of thunder echoed across the empty streets. I sat by the window, watching the rain pour down in endless sheets. The roof leaked slightly, dripping into a bucket beside my chair. I had grown used to fixing things on my own, used to being alone. But that night felt different. The air was heavy, almost electric. Somewhere deep inside, I felt something was coming, though I couldn't explain what or why. Maybe it was just loneliness playing tricks on me. Or maybe it was something else. The clock ticked past midnight. The rain grew stronger, beating against the windows like 1,000 small fists. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and tried to sleep. But then, I heard it. A sound at the gate. Faint, hesitant, but real. My heart skipped a beat. At first, I thought it was the wind. But then it came again, a knock. Soft, then louder. I froze for a moment, my heart pounding. No one visited me this late. I slowly got up, every step echoing in the quiet of the house, and walked toward the door. When I opened it, the world outside was a blur of rain and darkness. A figure stood under the flickering streetlight, soaked from head to toe. I squinted, unsure if my old eyes were playing tricks on me. Then I saw him, Ethan, my son, standing there, drenched, shivering, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years, guilt and sorrow. He opened his mouth to speak, but the sound of thunder drowned his words. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there, the rain spilling between us like a curtain of lost years. And for the first time in a long time, he looked small again, like the boy who once ran into my arms after a storm, afraid of the lightning. The past, the distance, the silence, it all hung in the air between us, fragile and unspoken. And that's where the night began to change everything. The rain poured harder, drumming against the tin roof and washing the world in silver streaks. For a few long seconds, I couldn't move. It was as if time itself had frozen, me standing in the doorway, him standing outside in the storm. The years of distance between us felt heavier than the rain that soaked him. Ethan's face was pale, his hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes filled with something I could only describe as pain. His shoulders trembled, not from the cold, but from something deeper, a weariness that only the heart could cause. Without a word, I stepped aside. He entered quietly, his shoes leaving muddy prints on the old wooden floor. I closed the door behind him, and for the first time in years, my house didn't feel empty. It felt alive again, heavy with emotion but alive. The storm outside seemed to mirror the storm between us. I could feel questions rising like tides inside me. Why now? Why tonight? But I said nothing. I simply handed him a towel, the same way I used to when he was a child coming home soaked from the rain. He took it silently, his eyes never meeting mine. He sat down in the old chair by the window, the same chair where his father once used to read the newspaper, where Ethan used to sit as a boy to tell me about his dreams. That chair had been empty for years. Seeing him there again made my chest tighten with a mix of relief and ache. The clock ticked softly. The sound of rain filled the spaces where words should have been. The air between us was heavy with unspoken apologies and buried years. He looked around the house slowly. The faded curtains, the old photographs on the wall, the same small table where we once shared every meal. Nothing had changed, except him. His face carried the marks of time and responsibility. There was a shadow in his eyes, the kind that comes from realizing too late the value of what was lost. I watched him closely, wondering what had brought him back after all this time. He finally reached into his jacket pocket and pulled something out, a small folded envelope, creased from water and time. He placed it on the table, next to the old vase of wilted flowers. My hands trembled as I looked at it. My name was written on it, in his handwriting, Mom. For a moment, I didn't touch it. I just stared at it, afraid of what it might hold, afraid that it might open old wounds that had barely scarred over. He sat in silence, his fingers gripping the edge of the chair. The thunder rolled in the distance, soft and lingering, as if even the sky was listening. I reached for the envelope. The paper was damp, soft around the edges. Inside was a short note, no more than a few lines. The ink had smudged in places, but I could still read the words. Words that made my throat tighten and my heart ache. It wasn't a letter from Ethan. It was a hospital discharge summary, addressed not to him, but to her. Claire. The name hit me like a wave. My breath caught. The lines mentioned something about severe emotional trauma and loss. My hand shook. I looked up at him. His eyes were glistening, but he didn't look away. In that silence, I began to piece the puzzle together. Claire wasn't with him. Something had happened. Something that had broken whatever life they had built together. The kind of pain that makes you look for what's real again. Ethan finally lifted his gaze. His lips trembled slightly, as if words were fighting to come out, but couldn't. His eyes said everything his mouth couldn't. Regret, grief, and a longing to come home. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. A mother's heart doesn't demand explanations when she sees her child drowning in sorrow. It only opens. Without thinking, I walked to the kitchen, poured a cup of tea, and placed it in front of him, the way I used to every evening after he came home from school. The gesture was small, but it said more than words could. It said, "You're still my son. You still belong here." He stared at the cup for a long moment before wrapping his hands around it. His fingers shook slightly. He took a sip, then lowered his head. The silence between us began to soften. The storm outside began to ease, the thunder fading into distant murmurs. A faint smell of wet earth and nostalgia filled the room. I sat across from him, watching the boy I raised try to find his way back from the man he had become. Memories flooded my mind. His first birthday, his school plays, the nights I stayed awake sewing his clothes, the day he left home carrying a suitcase and a heart full of dreams. I remembered every goodbye we ever said, but none hurt as much as the one that never had words, the one where he stopped calling. And yet, in that moment, I realized something. I had never truly stopped waiting for him. No matter how quiet the house became, some part of me had always left the porch light on for him, always believed he would return, maybe not as the same boy, but as the man who'd remember where his home was. The rain began to soften into a drizzle. The rhythm of the drops slowed, like a heartbeat calming after sorrow. Ethan looked toward the window, then back at me. His face carried the kind of exhaustion that goes beyond sleepless nights, the exhaustion of guilt. I could sense that he had come not just for shelter, but for forgiveness. Maybe from me, maybe from himself, maybe from both. The clock struck 2 in the morning. I told him to rest, motioning toward his old room. He hesitated, then nodded. He rose from the chair slowly, his movements uncertain, almost fragile. He walked down the familiar hallway, past the photographs of his childhood, the ones I could never bring myself to take down. When he disappeared into his room, I sat there for a long time, staring at the closed door. The sound of rain had become a gentle whisper now. I felt something shift inside me, a warmth that had been missing for years. But beneath that warmth, there was a quiet unease. Something told me that his return wasn't just about missing me. It was about something deeper, something painful, something that Storm had brought with him. As I cleaned the muddy floor, I glanced at the table, the hospital paper still lying there. I folded it carefully, placed it in the drawer, and whispered a small prayer. Whatever storm had brought my son home, I hoped it would finally pass. Yet, deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Because sometimes, life doesn't bring people back for comfort. It brings them back for closure. And as I turned off the light and looked out the window one last time, I saw it, the faint glimmer of dawn breaking through the rain clouds. The night had ended, but the story between us had only just begun. The morning after the storm arrived softly, as if the world itself was afraid to make too much noise. The sky outside was pale gray, carrying the last breath of the night's rain. Drops still clung to the window pane, shimmering like tiny memories that refused to fade. I woke early, as I always did. Old habits never die, even when the house grows quiet, even when the years weigh heavier on the bones. The kettle hissed, the faint scent of tea filled the air, and the wooden floor creaked beneath my feet. For a moment, I forgot that my son was home. Then I saw the door to his old room, slightly open, a thin line of light spilling through. I paused. It felt strange, almost sacred, to have someone breathing in that room again after all this time. I thought about knocking, but instead I waited. There's a rhythm to motherhood that never leaves you, that instinct to wait, to sense, to listen before you act. The kind that once told me when he was sick, hungry, or heartbroken, even before he said a word. Soon, I heard footsteps. Slow, hesitant. Ethan emerged from the room wearing the same clothes from last night, his hair still damp, his face pale from a sleepless night. He looked older than I remembered, not just in years, but in spirit. He walked into the kitchen, quietly taking in every detail. The chipped tiles, the old clock that still ticked offbeat, the curtain I had mended more times than I could count. Everything he once called home was still here, untouched, waiting for him. He sat at the table without a word. I poured him tea again. The same ritual, yet everything between us had changed. Outside, the rain had stopped, but puddles glistened along the street. The world smelled fresh, cleansed, almost forgiving. Inside, silence filled the room like a soft fog, dense, heavy, but oddly comforting. As I watched him, my heart stirred with 1,000 emotions. Relief that he was here, sorrow for what had been lost, and curiosity for what pain had driven him back through the storm. There were answers in his eyes, but also walls too tall to climb. He looked at the framed photographs hanging above the table. One of them was from his college graduation, him smiling in his black gown, me standing beside him, pride shining through the wrinkles of time. Another was of him as a little boy, holding his father's hand, his eyes bright with the wonder of life. He stared at them for a long time. Then his gaze fell to the small frame beside them, a faded photograph of him and Claire taken during their wedding. It had been the last photo he'd sent me. I had framed it despite the distance, despite everything. A shadow crossed his face when he saw it. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the edge of the glass, as if touching a ghost. His hand trembled. I didn't ask what happened. Not yet. Sometimes, questions are like knives. They open wounds before they're ready to heal. Instead, I quietly said, "You should eat something." He nodded, though he didn't move. He was staring through the window now, lost somewhere far beyond the horizon. His shoulders slumped, his lips parted slightly, as if a word was caught between breath and sorrow. I could see it, the weight he carried. The kind that doesn't just sit on your back, but burrows into your chest. The kind that changes how a person breathes. I spent the morning pretending not to notice his silence. I moved about, cleaning, cooking, doing the small things that once made him feel at home. The familiar sounds, the clink of dishes, the shuffle of my slippers, the soft hum of the kettle, seemed to thaw something in the air. By noon, the sun had broken through the clouds. A weak, golden light filled the room. Ethan finally rose from the table and walked to the porch. He stood there for a while, looking out at the wet street, the dripping trees, the quiet world. I watched from inside as a light breeze lifted his hair. For a moment, I saw the boy he once was, the one who used to chase the rain, laughing, barefoot, full of dreams. And then, as quickly as the vision came, it vanished. He turned to me, his eyes red, tired. I could see he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the strength. So I didn't push him. A mother doesn't always need words to know. Sometimes, silence is confession enough. When he finally did speak, his voice was soft, almost a whisper. Not a story, not an explanation, just fragments. The kind that slip out when pain leaks through the cracks of restraint. Though he said little, I understood. Claire had fallen into depression months ago. The doctors had said it was treatable, manageable, but the city life they lived, the distance, the expectations, all had taken their toll. Ethan had tried to hold everything together. The job, the bills, the facade of happiness. But one night she broke. She had left a note, just one line, and disappeared. For weeks, he searched everywhere. Hospitals, friends, police stations. And when she was finally found, she was alive but empty, a shadow of herself. The hospital papers I'd seen were from that night. She had survived, but something inside her hadn't. As he sat there, his hands clasped tightly, I realized that this wasn't just a son coming home. This was a man unraveling, finally allowing himself to fall apart where it was safe to do so. And for the first time in years, I saw something in his eyes that made my heart ache. The same helplessness he'd had as a child when his father died. The same need for comfort. The same search for warmth. He didn't cry. But grief has many faces, and his was silent, hollow, and raw. I wanted to reach out to hold him, but something stopped me. Maybe pride, maybe fear of scaring him away again. So I just stood close enough for him to feel that he wasn't alone. The day faded slowly. Shadows stretched across the living room as the sun sank behind the trees. He remained quiet, sometimes lost in thought, sometimes staring at the floor. Later, as night returned, I found him in the backyard, sitting on the old wooden bench his father had built decades ago. The air was cool, filled with the scent of wet grass and memory. He was holding something small, a ring, Claire's wedding ring. He didn't notice me watching. He just sat there, turning it in his hand, lost in a world of what-ifs. And then, softly, I realized something. He hadn't just come home because he needed comfort. He had come home because he didn't know who he was anymore without her, or without me. The rain had washed away the noise of his life, leaving only the truth behind. The boy who once promised to take care of his mother had become the man who needed his mother to remind him how to start again. That night, as I lay in bed, I listened to the quiet of the house. For the first time in years, I heard another heartbeat in the room next door. It was faint, uneven, but real. And I whispered to myself, he's home. Whatever happens, he's home. But even then, beneath that fragile peace, I knew the past had not finished. Speaking, there were still things left unsaid, regrets unhealed, and choices that would soon come knocking again. Because when a storm brings someone back, it's rarely done raining. The days that followed his return felt strangely still. The house, once so silent, now carried a new rhythm. The soft shuffle of footsteps in the hallway, the creak of doors that had been untouched for years, the faint sound of another breath moving through the walls. After so many years of waiting, I finally had my son home. It didn't feel like the reunion I had once imagined. He was here, but not entirely. His body sat at my table. His eyes followed the sunlight through the curtains. His voice murmured polite thank yous. But his mind, it was somewhere else. Somewhere dark. Each morning, I found him sitting by the window with his coffee untouched, his gaze lost beyond the rooftops, where the sky met the horizon. He rarely spoke unless I asked him something. Even then, his answers were short, quiet, like someone trying not to disturb their own thoughts. At first, I told myself he needed time. But time has a strange way of revealing what silence hides. On the third morning, I found him sitting in the living room, staring at an old family album I had left on the shelf years ago. The pages had yellowed, the plastic film had wrinkled, but the faces inside were frozen in time. His father holding him as a baby, me smiling beside them, Ethan in his first school uniform. He turned each page slowly, as if afraid the memories might crumble if he moved too fast. When he reached the final page, he stopped. There was a picture of him at 16, holding a homemade cake, grinning ear to ear. It was his birthday, the last one we celebrated before life began to change. He stared at that photograph for a long time, his thumb tracing the edge of the image. Then, without a word, he closed the album and placed it on the table. The sound of the cover snapping shut echoed in the quiet room like a sigh. It was then that I realized something simple but profound. Forgiveness doesn't arrive in one moment. It builds quietly, like dawn creeping into the night. And in that silence, I felt it happening, not just from me to him, but from him to himself. Later that day, while cooking, I caught him glancing around the kitchen. He was looking at things he hadn't seen in years. The old copper pan, the clock that never kept the right time, the vase filled with plastic flowers he'd once called forever blooms. His eyes softened, and in that brief moment, I saw the boy I used to know, the one who loved this small, imperfect home more than anything. But guilt is a heavy chain. Every kindness I offered, a meal, a gentle word, a smile, seemed to tighten it around him. I could see it in his posture, in the way he avoided meeting my eyes for too long. He was grateful, yes, but ashamed. He didn't need to say it. I already knew. He blamed himself, not just for forgetting me, but for letting the distance between us become normal, for making me a ghost in his life while he built a new one. That evening, I heard him in his room, rummaging through the closet. When I peeked in, I saw him holding an old shoebox, the one that had once held his letters, drawings, and report cards. It had been untouched for over a decade. He opened it and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a child's note written in blue crayon. I remembered it instantly. It said, "Mom, when I'm big, I'll buy you a big house and you won't have to work." He sat on the edge of the bed, holding that note as if it were a lifeline. His shoulders trembled slightly. For a moment, I thought he might break down, but instead, he pressed the paper to his chest and closed his eyes. That's when I realized this was his reckoning. Life had finally forced him to face the promises he once made and forgot. And though I could see the pain it brought him, I also knew it was the beginning of healing. In the following days, he started helping around the house, fixing a leaking tap, trimming the garden, repairing the old fence. Simple things, small things, but meaningful. Every nail he hammered, every broken hinge he mended, seemed to repair something deeper inside him too. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. There was a rhythm to our silence, an understanding that words might only get in the way. But at night, when I passed by his room, I sometimes heard him whispering to himself. Not words I could make out, just a low murmur like someone speaking to ghosts. Perhaps he was talking to her. Perhaps to himself. Perhaps to the boy he once was. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he joined me on the porch. We sat side by side, watching the light fade. The air was cool, filled with the sound of crickets. I could feel the question rising in my heart. Will he stay? Or is this just a pause before he leaves again? But I didn't ask, because love, I've learned, doesn't hold people hostage. It lets them find their own way back. Still, I knew that every piece carries a shadow, that whatever storm had brought him home was not done with him yet. The next morning proved it. When I went to tidy his room, I found a small, half-open envelope on a nightstand. Inside was another hospital document, newer than the first. I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity, mixed with fear, pushed me forward. The letterhead read, "Discharge Summary, Patient, Claire Matthews." My heart sank. The note was dated only a week ago. She had been released from the psychiatric facility, with instructions for continued supervision and emotional support. But the most painful line was at the bottom. Next of kin, no contact provided. No contact, not even his name. It hit me like a cold wind. Whatever had happened between them, it wasn't just distance. It was detachment. She hadn't just walked away. She had erased him. I folded the paper carefully, placed it back where I found it, and sat on the edge of his bed. For the first time since he arrived, I felt fear. Not the kind that comes from losing someone, but the kind that comes from knowing they're already lost, even while sitting right next to you. That night, he didn't eat much. He barely spoke. He stared at the wall as if searching for a window that wasn't there. And as I watched him, something inside me began to ache, not as a mother, but as a human being. Because sometimes the hardest thing to forgive isn't what someone does to you. It's what they do to themselves. Before going to bed, I stood at his door and whispered softly, "It's okay, Ethan. Whatever it is, you can let it go." He didn't reply, but I saw his hand tighten around the small note he still carried, the one he wrote me as a child. Outside, the rain began again, soft at first, then steady, as if the heavens had decided to keep reminding us of the night he came back. And as I lay in bed, listening to the steady rhythm against the roof, I realized that forgiveness, real forgiveness, isn't a single act. It's a quiet decision you make every day, even when your heart still hurts. I had already forgiven him long ago. Now I just prayed he could forgive himself. The days grew warmer, though the sky still carried the scent of rain. The storm that had brought Ethan home had long passed, but in many ways, the storm inside him had only just begun. He spent most of his time outdoors now, fixing small things around the house, cleaning the gutters, repainting the porch. There was something almost desperate about the way he worked, as if repairing broken wood and rusted hinges could somehow mend what had cracked inside him. I watched from the window as he moved with quiet determination, his shoulders heavy, his face calm but distant. Every evening, he would sit on the old bench in the backyard, watching the sun fade into gold and then into gray. Sometimes, he carried that small note from his childhood in his pocket. Sometimes, he just stared into the horizon, as if expecting someone to appear. I wanted to ask him if he'd heard from Claire, but the words always stopped at my lips. I had learned that some questions aren't meant to be asked. Not because the answers hurt, but because the silence already tells you what you need to know. Still, every night, I prayed for both of them. For her healing, for his peace, for the small chance that life might give them a softer ending. It was on a Thursday afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after his return, that the world shifted again. I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard the sound of a car stopping outside. Not a delivery truck, not a neighbor. Something about the sound made my heart pause. Ethan was in the backyard, his sleeves rolled up, his hands covered in paint. I went to the window and looked out. A silver car sat by the curb. The driver's door opened slowly, and a woman stepped out. Even from a distance, I knew. It was Claire. She was thinner than I remembered, her skin pale, her movements cautious, the kind of carefulness that comes from someone still learning how to exist after breaking. She stood there for a long time, looking at the house, her hand gripping the car door as if afraid to let go. I didn't move. I couldn't. My heart felt trapped between confusion and worry. Ethan hadn't seen her yet, but then she started walking, slow, hesitant steps that seemed to weigh more than her body could carry. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes, each sound sharp and small, like the echo of unfinished conversations. When Ethan finally turned, the paintbrush slipped from his hand. He froze. The distance between them was barely 10 feet, but the air between them felt like 1,000 miles. I stayed inside, watching from the window, not as a mother intruding, but as a witness to something inevitable. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Every second of silence between them screamed louder than words ever could. Ethan took a small step forward, then stopped. Claire lowered her gaze. Her hand shook. For a long, suspended moment, it felt as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then she reached in her bag and pulled something out, a small envelope. She placed it on the wooden bench and stepped back. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear a sound. She stood there for another moment, her face fragile yet strangely peaceful. Then she turned and walked away. Ethan didn't move. He just stared at the envelope as her car drove off down the street, the sound of tires fading into the hum of the wind. When he finally picked it up, he didn't open it right away. He just sat down on the bench, turning it in his hands. The late afternoon light fell across his face, and for a moment, I saw both the boy he used to be and the man he had become, both broken, both try to find their way back to something they'd lost. I stepped outside quietly. The air was cool, the scent of wet earth still lingering. I didn't speak. I simply stood at the doorway, letting him know he wasn't alone. Eventually, he opened the envelope. Inside was a short letter. I couldn't see the words, but I could see what they did to him. His hands trembled. His breath hitched. He closed his eyes, as if each line carved through him. Then, slowly, he folded the paper and placed it on his lap. He didn't cry, but I could feel the ache radiating from him, the kind of pain that doesn't make noise because it's too deep for sound. He sat there long after the sun disappeared, until the first stars began to show. I stayed on the porch, watching the darkness settle around us, waiting for him to stand. When he finally came inside, his face was pale but calm. Something had shifted in him, a quiet acceptance, maybe, or the kind of exhaustion that comes when you finally stop fighting what life has already decided. That night, he didn't eat. He didn't speak. He just went to his room and closed the door softly behind him. I found the letter on the bench later, caught beneath the wind. I shouldn't have read it, but something inside me needed to understand the storm that lived in my son's eyes. The letter was simple. Claire had written that she was leaving the city, that she couldn't rebuild her life in the same place where it had fallen apart. She thanked him for loving her, for trying, for staying longer than anyone else would have. But she also said something that broke me as much as it broke him. She wrote, "You once told me love means never letting go, but I think love is knowing when to." There was no anger in her words, just peace, a soft, painful peace that often comes when two people finally accept that love isn't always enough to heal what time has broken. I folded the letter gently, my hands trembling. I placed it back where I found it and whispered a small prayer into the night. The next morning, Ethan didn't mention it. He acted as if nothing had happened, but I could see it in the way he moved, slower, quieter, as though something inside him had finally gone still. The days that followed were calm, almost too calm. He continued helping around the house, fixing things that didn't need fixing, working until the light faded each evening. I let him. Sometimes, work is the only thing that keeps a person standing when the heart wants to collapse. But even as the sun rose and set, I knew something was changing in him. The way he looked at the house, the way he watched me from across the table, the way he lingered longer on the porch each night, his eyes drifting toward the stars. He was finding peace, but it was the kind of peace that feels like goodbye. And as I watched him, my heart quietly broke again. Because I knew that when people come home after a long time, it's never just to stay. It's to remember how to leave gently. The last few weeks drifted by quietly, the kind of quiet that follows after a long storm. The air was clearer now, the mornings softer. The rain had stopped visiting as often, but its memory lived in every scent that passed through the open window. Petrichor, old earth, a touch of something bittersweet. Ethan had begun to smile again, not the carefree smile of his youth, but a gentler one, the kind that hides more than it shows. He spoke less about the past, though sometimes I would catch him looking at the empty chair across the dining table. There was no anger in his eyes anymore, just a tired kindness that comes from letting go. The house had changed too. Where once it echoed with silence, it now carried small sounds again. The hum of the kettle, the soft scrape of a chair, the faint rhythm of his footsteps down the hallway. It felt like life had crept back in quietly, one heartbeat at a time. One evening, I found him in the attic, sorting through old boxes. Dust hung in the air, dancing in the sunlight that spilled through the narrow window. He was holding a photo album, one I hadn't seen in years. The cover was cracked, the edges worn, but the pages still carried our lives, frozen in time, untouched by everything that had happened since. He showed me a photograph of him as a little boy, sitting on the front steps, holding a paper boat. I remembered that day vividly. It had rained for hours, and the street had become a shallow stream. He had spent the entire afternoon launching paper boats into the water, watching them drift away. When one got stuck, he would run down the road to free it. He never let a single one sink. Now, as I watched him trace the photo with his thumb, I realized he was doing the same thing with his memories, releasing the ones that had drowned, rescuing the ones that still floated. He stayed up in the attic for a long time, organizing, dusting, remembering. It felt like he was preparing for something, though he didn't say what. That night, the wind picked up again. Dark clouds rolled in from the horizon, the kind that promised another storm. I stood by the window, watching the trees bend and sway. There was something familiar about the smell of rain. It was as if time had looped back to that night months ago, the night he had come home, drenched and broken, but still my son. He joined me by the window. We didn't speak. We just watched the sky together, the flashes of lightning painting the world white for brief, beautiful seconds. When the first drops began to fall, he turned to me and smiled faintly. There was a stillness in his expression, a quiet decision already made. Later, I found a small envelope on the kitchen counter. My name was written on it in his handwriting, steady, deliberate. I didn't open it right away. I waited until the rain grew heavier, the sound of it filling the house like a heartbeat. Inside, there was a short note. He wrote that he was leaving for the countryside, not to run away, but to start again. There was an old house near the coast where he had found work restoring wooden cottages. He said he needed time, not to forget, but to forgive himself for everything he couldn't fix. At the end, he wrote, "Mom, I came home because I was lost. I'm leaving now because you helped me find my way again. You never stopped waiting, even when I didn't deserve it. I'll carry that love wherever I go." The words blurred as I read them, not because of the ink, but because of the tears that refused to stay still. The next morning, he left quietly. The sun had returned after the storm, the air cool and clean. He hugged me once, long, wordless, the kind of embrace that carries a lifetime of things unsaid. Then he picked up his bag and stepped outside. He turned back once at the gate and smiled. And in that smile, I saw both the little boy who used to chase paper boats and the man who had finally learned how to let them go. Days turned into weeks again. The house felt emptier but not lonely. His presence lingered in the repaired porch, the repainted walls, the small acts of care that only he could have done. Sometimes, I'd catch myself setting 2 plates on the table out of habit. Sometimes, I'd open the door expecting to see him coming up the path. But there was peace now, not the peace of having everything, but the peace of understanding what you've already lost and still being grateful it once belonged to you. One evening, months later, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, I heard the sound of rain again. It came softly at first, then stronger, drumming against the roof, washing the dust from the world. I turned on the porch light, a small ritual I had kept since the night he came home. The rain shimmered under the light, silver and endless. I didn't know where Ethan was that night, whether he was standing under the same sky, watching the same storm. But somehow, I felt he was all right. I closed my eyes and whispered a small prayer, not for him to come back, but for him to stay safe wherever life had taken him. Because that's what mothers do. We love not to hold, but to let go. The storm lasted through the night, steady and strong. And when morning came, sunlight streamed through the clouds, warm and golden, filling every corner of the house with quiet grace. I walked outside and looked at the world washed clean again. The porch glistened. The air smelled of new beginnings. The light I'd left on was still glowing, a single, soft reminder that love, once lit, never truly fades. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because everything had finally found its place. Somewhere beyond the horizon, perhaps near the sea, a man stood watching the rain too, carrying the memory of a mother who never stopped waiting, and a home where the light had always stayed on.